So now you're thoroughly confused on how to find probabilities, and we've got all these extra terms to figure out. Well, we're finding probabilities and they can be really confusing. So one way to help us organize them are tree diagrams, and you saw that in the last video. We basically break it down, but this is the very, very basic. And remember that this isn't exactly it, but if we find A or B, we add them together. Now remember, if they're not mutually exclusive, we have to subtract that conditional probability. But basically, to find A or B, we add the two probabilities together. To find A and B, we multiply the probabilities. And here is why. So we're going to take a look. We're going to look at a tree diagram. So imagine that you're tossing a coin, and we can draw a tree diagram to show what happens, what's the probability of getting certain things when we toss this coin. Okay. So there's all those pictures, but I'm just going to go ahead and draw it myself right here. Okay, so you can draw a tree diagram sideways or up and down. So I toss a coin and I have a chance of getting heads or tails, right? And I have a 1/2 chance of getting heads and a 1/2 chance of getting tails the first time I toss my coin, right? And now, so that's event A, right? Event A is tossing the coin one time. Now event B is going to be tossing a coin the second time. And I have the same options, right? I could have heads or I could have tails. Those are my two things that could happen. And each time they're going to be a 1/2 chance, or 1 in 2, or 0.5, 50%, however you want to say it, chance of getting each one, right? So what is the probability of A and B happening? Heads, right? So what if the probability, what if the event A is getting heads the first time and then event B is getting heads the second time? Okay, well, I have a 1/2 chance of getting heads the first time. And then if you look down here, what is my sample space? What are my options for what I could get if I toss this coin? Okay, well, I could have tossed heads, heads. I could toss heads, tails. I could toss tails, heads, or tails, tails. Those are all the different options that I could get, right? Those are my 4 different options in the sample space. And what I'm trying to do is, what is the probability of getting heads and heads? Okay, well, that would be this one right here. Only this one, right? And so that's my favorable outcome is 1 of 4 possible outcomes, right? Because there's 2 outcomes and then we have 2 outcomes for each of those. So now I end up with 4 possible outcomes. So what is my actual probability of getting, what's the probability of getting heads, heads? Well, it's 1 out of 4, okay? Because here's 4 options, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's one of them, okay? How do I get that in the tree diagram? Well, look, half of my options are going to be heads first, right? Half of them are going to be that. And then half of those are going to be heads second, okay? And let me say that again. The first time I toss my coin, half of the time I'm going to get heads, okay? So I'm already at half of my times that I toss it. And how many times am I going to get heads the second time? Well, half of those. Well, what is half of 1/2? Well, it's 1/2 times 1/2, which is dun, da, 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 1/4. So to find the probability of both of them happening, I just multiplied down the tree diagram, okay? I multiply, or in some cases, you know, you could see across, right? You would multiply, it doesn't really matter which way you draw it, across, okay? So I multiply across. But what happens if I want to find the probability of or? Let me go to the next one. So I want to find the probability of or. Well, let's see. Okay. I found that the probability of heads and heads is 0.25. Well, what's the probability of heads and heads or heads, tails? Okay, so I want to now find the probability of this branch. Okay, we already found the probability of this branch. It's 0.25 because you just multiply, right? But then what's the probability of heads, tails as well? So what's the probability of getting one of those 2 options? Well, the probability of getting this option is 1/4, and the probability of getting this option is 1/4. So the probability of getting either or is 1/4 plus 1/4, right? Because when we have or we're going to add them together. So that's 2/4 or 1/2. So I have a 1/2 chance of getting either of those. And it makes sense, right? It really does make sense because how many options are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, tails, tails. Those are my 4 options. What's the probability of getting one of these two? Well, it's 2 out of the 4 total options, okay? So in a tree diagram, if you're looking like down the diagram, you basically multiply this way, right? So we're saying, what's the probability of both of these happening at the same time? We're going to multiply. But at the end of the branches, if we're trying to figure out the probability of either of these happening, then we're going to add them together.